Hi, I'm Ophi YouTube Videos. I figured out that my microphone was bad because I was holding it instead of clipping it to my shirt, so I have fixed that. This is a second and much more thorough run through at something that I already talked about on my channel this month. You can find my previous video about the Drake Bell Darvo campaign. I will be retreading some of that information, but that does have my initial thoughts on the documentary Quiet on Set that recently came out, and my initial knee-jerk reactions that led me to the rabbit hole that I am now recording from the bottom of. We are being very nuanced here. I've even put up a little sign. This video is not a place to question Alexa's credibility or the motives behind all of the actions that she's ever taken. I'm not here to dismiss her credibility on any allegations that she has made or any statements that she's made about abuse that she has suffered, and I do keep an eye on my comment section, so I just want to be clear right off the bat that this is not a place where I want that to be happening. That scared me so bad. People who are here for an unnuanced takedown of Alexa and everything she has ever stood for or publicly stated are not on the right channel, but people who are willing to engage with these things from a perspective of assuming positive intent and recognizing failures in follow-through when we see them are the people who I want to be communicating to with this video. This also is not a place where I am discrediting either Drake Bell as a victim of Brian Peck's with regards to anything that he mentioned in the Quiet on Set documentary. And it is also not a place where I am dismissing the allegations made by victims of Drake Bell. Victims who have sought justice inside of the court and outside of it. Ex-girlfriends who have given testimonies that aren't even included in his pleading guilty to reckless endangerment of a minor and disseminating information harmful to minors. I also want to be transparent with you for my sourcing from some of these claims. I am using footage from an interview from a podcast called Good Morning Mayberry. This podcast is hosted by somebody who Alexa has later stated to be her stalker. Shift has exhibited behaviors that I am not comfortable with, and some behaviors that I've noticed online that I'm not comfortable with have been attributed to Shift, whether or not they were the ones who did them. This podcast, however, is the only place that I could find where these founding members of Eat Predators had gone on the record about their story and their involvement in the project. In researching for this video, I watched all of Alexa's videos in a stream series that we will be talking about later, where she talked about each of these women, and I didn't personally find anything that she said to discredit them bad enough for me not to view what they're saying in this podcast as a valid source. Kaylee and Kay have not featured on another episode of the podcast. I don't know if this is to do with the restraining order that was placed against Shift or what, but I just don't want to use all three of these people as the same level of credible witness, because I think Kaylee and Kay both are very reliable, even if we do have concerns with some of the behaviors that Shift exhibited. A lot of this argument that I'm making today is about why the optics of your operation matter, so that's why I just want to be very clear where I'm coming from and what I'm trying and not trying to do here. So to make where I'm coming from clear, I have absolutely no personal experience engaging with Alexa. Anybody who knows her or anybody who has been directly engaged with the Eat Predators community, fan base, whatever we'll call it in this video. I have no personal experience with anybody who has been on the set of any kind of television show, let alone a Nickelodeon or Dan Schneider show. I don't have a personal vested interest in doing this as a takedown. I was a fan of Eat Predators and have concerns with the way that the movement has grown and taken shape. The majority of information that is readily available to people like me who are beginning to have those concerns is very colored by levels of personal entanglement with Alexa that have allowed her to kind of shoot them down and shroud herself in some level of protection, because it's being treated now like a betrayal and a friendship breakup more so than somebody coming forward with valid critiques about somebody who was organizing in a space with them. I think I'm a little bit too inherently cynical of this sort of thing. My initial perception of Alexa was that I respected what she was doing and admired her greatly, but did already have some minor discomforts with it. But I wasn't fully invested in this. I have never monetarily supported Eat Predators. I was watching a few streams a week of her podcast. We're going to get into her podcast and some of the things that she talks about, how I found her, and everything that I've unearthed in the process of figuring out exactly what wasn't sitting right with me. Eat Predators is described a lot of different ways by pretty much whoever you ask, but if you asked Alexa Nikolas, I think she would say that it's a survivor-led collective. Eat Predators hosts and organizes and publicizes protests, but for the sake of what we're talking about in this video, one of the most important aspects of it is Eat Predators Daily, which is Alexa Nikolas's live stream. She uses these streams for a few different purposes, like sharing information about what's going on with different cases in the news about predators and survivors, placing public pressure on individuals to apologize for things Alexa is sometimes involved in and sometimes not, and just basically keeping her viewers informed and up to date. According to the podcast I mentioned earlier and the two founders who were there alongside Alexa, originally Eat Predators was supposed to be about the music industry. They started off protesting Diplo because he had been performing at an all-ages show. The original founders of this protesting group found the fact that this alleged predator was performing at an all-ages show in front of an ice cream truck to be disturbing. The ice cream truck also featured Eat the Rich motif, which is how the slogan Eat Predators was born. The music industry was a common tie-in of trauma from multiple people who were organizing. Alexa Nikolas herself has an abuser who was popular in the EDM space, and so did at least one other organizer in the early days of Eat Predators. So this music movement thing was kind of what they were all focused on at first. But in recent months, Eat Predators' focus has largely shifted to children's television and Nickelodeon. We're going to be talking more about that soon. I was a pretty frequent viewer of Eat Predators compared to my usual avoidance of people live streaming. I had some weird feelings about it, like I said, but I also kind of kept telling myself this live streamification of activism was always going to happen, and that it was probably unfair of me to hold Alexa accountable for something that was just going to happen culturally. And because I don't watch live streams, maybe I told myself I just didn't understand it. Some things that struck me as odd are just this presentation of herself as somebody who is like giving the news in this clearly biased way and acting like it is not biased, as well as the fact that a super chat effectively means that if you give her enough money, you get to interrupt her right in the middle of a thought, and she'll be like, "Oh, that's so sweet, thank you so much." I understand wanting to thank people who give you money, and I understand that it's a flaw of the platform itself that super chats are designed to be paid interruptions, but it still never sat quite right with me. With all that being said, though, I did have a interest in people who have had experiences with Nickelodeon talking about it. As I mentioned in my first video about this, I'm Glad My Mom Died. We're going to talk more about that later too. And I really appreciate the work that Allison Stoner does in this same space. So I was really interested in what Alexa was doing, and on a surface level, a lot of the words that she's saying are very close to what people who are more educated in theory espouse. A lot of the things that she says sound like misappropriations of therapy speak, and not in a way that feels evolved beyond just enjoying having words for things. That's mean. I'm going to try to be more constructive. I started to watch the Eat Predators podcast as a result of Notable Beef number 1. Don't worry, there's also nuance about this part, but I want to just present the bare bones of Notable Beef number 1 before I give you my perspective on it, because I know that I am clouded by a lot of Alexa information that I have not yet shared. Notable beef number 1 is between Alexa and the cast of both the show and the podcast for Ned's Declassified School Survival Guide, but primarily Lindsay Shaw, who played Mose. I had a crush on Mose as a child in a way that most token girl characters on like boy shows didn't really work for me. I liked Mose, and then she was like a weird gay bully in Pretty Little Liars, and I already like cared a lot about Maya with Emily, and then Maya was dead, and I still don't really think they thought that through. I don't think they knew what they were doing when they killed Maya off. They were just hoping that they would like figure it out when they got there. None of this matters. Lindsay Shaw was in Ned's Declassified School Survival Guide and Pretty Little Liars. That's anything you need to retain out of what I just said. This means that she and Alexa were both child actresses at around the same time, although I'm pretty sure Ned's Declassified aired later than Zoe 101 did. In either case, they spent a lot of time together and seem to have been very close friends. This friendship comes up during the podcast that the Ned's Declassified cast later begins. We're gonna get to my feelings about that podcast. On the podcast, where they already have established a tone of being very inappropriate and not having a lot of boundaries in terms of the kind of things that they don't edit out, they had a guest star who also had at one point been at least some level of friends with Alexa. It is beyond me how this did not get edited out. I had been seeing reels of the Ned's Declassified cast around, like on Facebook and Instagram, and I knew I wasn't interested in listening to their podcast, but I was like, oh, whatever, good for them, it's cool, they're still friends. But the friends hanging out vibe of the podcast is overbearingly uncomfortable when they get into click mode, which, I mean, I kind of do subscribe to the BoJack Horseman theory of fame, where you're just permanently suspended at whatever age you were famous, so, like, it makes sense. That's still very middle school mean girl table. I didn't go to public school, I'm just assuming. They were talking about their mutual and also both have ended relationships at some point with Alexa. I'm not going to play a ton of it because I feel like if I let myself start showing you a bunch of clips, that's going to end up being so much of the video, and you don't need as much of this in your head as I already have. But just a little taste of what it's like and what my perception of some of the other episodes also felt similar, even when they weren't directly bad-mouthing people.
Yeah, I'm like,
I mean, yeah, for sure.
You know, Jeanette, Zoe 101,
cool,
Alexa.
You can say my name, Devin. It's okay to say my name. You're safe to say my name.
I looked back on the Ned's Declassified YouTube channel last night to try to directly download their episode and cut out that part so that I could have that without Alexa's reaction, and I couldn't. So I watched the Ned's Declassified podcast episode after Alexa had alerted me to it, and it was still up at that point, though the title had been changed. But it wasn't until I had wasted a pretty significant chunk of time listening to that episode of the podcast on like 3.5 speed that I realized they just completely skipped over all of the parts that Alexa had responded to, and I thought that was strange. So I went back to YouTube and I copied the transcript, and when I Control F'd the transcript and I searched for words like Alexa, her mom, hit her, fist fight, spouting out into the universe, I couldn't find any of that, so it does look like at some point that conversation was censored out.
Alexa, we
Yeah.
used to be. Wait. Oh.
You alright?
Oh my God.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah.
I remember.
It's a weird vibe. That show has a weird vibe, but I structured this video in a way where I'm not telling you why I think that is yet. So this conversation about Alexa is brought to Alexa's attention because of course it is. It's Twitter. Everyone who listens to these podcasts also follow all of these former child stars on Twitter, I assume, and are like begging for juicy drama. Alexa responds over the course of a couple different videos on Eat Predators Daily. Again, I'm not showing you a ton of footage from her lives, both because they would really extend the runtime of a video I'm already expecting to be fairly lengthy, and just because I don't think it's necessary, but some reference here.
I thought it was actually going to go into, I know I feel maybe horrible about what Alexa has gone through. I thought that would maybe be where Lindsay was going. Like, I know Alexa's had a hard life. She's gone through a lot. Wishing her well. I saw her protest or, whatever. But no, that's not where this went. It was like I know. Like I was some type of nothing.
Alexa asks multiple times for an apology that she does not receive. She cites the harm that is done by using dehumanizing language.
But I'm crazy, but it was like, she's intense.
Yeah.
I'm crazy, but she's like intense.
I also want to say I had conflated in my mind because Lindsay heart reacted a comment on Instagram or YouTube, I can't remember which, that referred to Alexa as a psycho. It was a mean comment from somebody. Lindsay liked it. That was the dehumanizing language that was being asked for an apology for, and that Christy said that wouldn't be received. I also want to say that because I just really hope that the clips that I used from Eat Predators don't get claimed, because otherwise a lot of this is just gonna not be as easy to recap. If it does, I guess I'll cut this part out, or you'll have just heard me voice over what was happening. I don't know. Eventually, Alexa was told by Christy Carlson Romano, and Christy is somebody who, if you don't already know who she is, yes you do, and also you definitely will by the end of the video, but I'm not quite getting into that yet. Christy, who is the founder of Podco, the podcast company that distributes the Ned's Survival Guide podcast, told Alexa, among other things that, again, just feel like gossip we should not be privy to, that she would not expect an apology from her. So, okay. Alexa addressed the issue again on her live stream, and as of tonight, right now, while I'm recording this, is addressing it again on another live stream. So by the end of this video, we'll have more information about her response to the most recent time that she seems to have been dug at by the Ned's Declassified crew. Basically, the way that this played out was Alexa was asking publicly for an apology. That apology did not come.
Yeah. I remember she got mad at me on Facebook. She blocked me.
We did that.
And again, I don't understand how this did not get edited out. My understanding is that Podco is relatively corporate, something we're going to get to, but you would think if they were, there would be an editor who would have said, this is really bad optics.
Like, if she, where is she?
She's like spouting off to the universe and stuff and had a kid. She's out there.
In terms of what Lindsay actually said about Alexa, like I said before, and as you've seen in that clip, she did say that Alexa was out there spouting off into the universe. She also spoke relatively highly of her, although she did not take up for her when the guest star was calling her crazy, and again didn't apologize after the fact, and liked messages that took her side in the ordeal. Are you ready? Ooh. I hope you can even tell that I just turned it on. Back to the nuance corner.
Yeah, no, but literally we shared, we did shrooms together for the first time,
We did. By the way, I was going full screen. I was like, wait. We did.
These two had a very emotionally entangled friendship. I'm not armchair diagnosing. I'm not saying this because me saying this sounds codependent is helpful. I'm saying it because who amongst us has not been emotionally entangled with a friend in a way that made us say mean things and refer to them unkindly after the fact? Posting it is a completely different thing. Absolutely not. Nobody should have been allowed to see that. If that were an isolated event, however, something that did not leak, although it wasn't even leaked, like they put it out on purpose, multiple people, I would think, had to sign off on that. No, I have to be strong. One time, I made somebody I loved angry enough that they posted a public Spotify playlist with that famous art, you know, like the I always almost call him John Waters, and that's not who it is. The Waterhouse Ophelia painting, the beautiful waterlogged, drowned, dead Ophelia that everybody knows. They posted a Spotify playlist with that as the cover and the title a reference to something that I said when we had a fight. I bring it up because it's funny. There were like a bunch of Taylor Swift songs on it. I'm not saying that for the purpose of reigniting beef or for saying that that's a circumstance where I was entirely in the right or anything like that. I'm saying that because sometimes very serious hurt can make us act in deeply unserious ways. And that, I think, is what I identify in the way that Lindsay and Alexa both kind of talk about each other.
I just like empathize with her mom. Dude, I got in a fist fight with her mom.
Sure. Oh.
I think Lindsay really just should have apologized and then said, I don't want to talk about Alexa anymore, and then not talked about Alexa anymore publicly. But in that one tiny, itty-bitty 1% nuance way, I kind of get it. I see two women who deeply hurt each other and who probably are not close to finding a way to communicate through that. Maybe someday they will. You're also not always obligated to mend a friendship that you realize on your way out the door is best over. Like I said, I'm not mad about that Spotify playlist anymore, but I'm also not interested in pursuing that friendship, which is fine. That doesn't mean anything negatively about them other than that I don't think that the relationship that we had serves both of them. It's possible and probable that that's also the case with Alexa and Lindsay. And judging by some of the patterns of behavior that we see from Alexa and the way that she treats and talks about other people who have been in the inner circle of predators and left, I don't know what information we don't know about Alexa having previously said things about Lindsay, and we will get back to why I can't extend a full benefit of the doubt and assume she was blameless here. But I gave myself a reward for Nuance Corner time, so I get to tell you about the Ned's Declassified podcast now, because that's the first tangent I'm allowed to do.
What do you think? Yeah? Any other comments?
She's holding her thoughts for the end. Okay. Roughly 5 minutes after I was like, my reward for Nuance Corner time is talking about the Ned's Declassified podcast, I thought to myself, what if I just went to bed? So I went to bed. But I do still want to talk about the Ned's Declassified podcast, so let's get into it. Again, I've structured this video into segments, not just the notable beefs, of which we still have quite a few to come, but also I pick and choose which tangents I'm letting myself go on, even though the runtime of this video may seem like I haven't. Although I will say that the fact that I already knew I was making a video about this was a relief, because I've had these thoughts about the Ned's Declassified podcast for like a while now, and I never wanted to watch enough episodes of it to make a video solely about that. I've watched so many hours of Eat Predators Daily for this. I can't do that with Ned's Declassified. But I also think there are some pretty inherent differences in what they're doing and where their shortcomings kind of aren't as disappointing to me as some of the ones that I'm pointing out of Alexa's in this video. So, tangent number 1. The Ned's Declassified School Survival podcast is weird. My ability to conceive of the Ned's Declassified podcast as something with a weird vibe that I don't like, but also not something I would feel a need to warn people against, is another factor into me wanting to make this video. The Ned's Declassified podcast is weird though, because it feels to me as if the people hosting that show want to have it a lot of different ways. It is a middle school bully table, sit around, listen to the click, giggle, and laugh about how cool it was to be a famous child actor. It is somewhere to talk about vulnerabilities and trauma. It's somewhere that they're obviously networking and kind of trying to build their career, despite the first of those three things being pretty inherently unprofessional. Podco in general. So Podco appears to have become very corporate, like I said. It's going to take me a little while to unpack all of the Christy Carlson fingerprints all over this saga, but we are getting there. And I said this in my video about the Drake Bell Darvo campaign, but if you haven't already seen it, pause my video and go watch Cheyanne's 2 videos about the Alexa versus Christy Carlson Romano debacle that was happening a few months ago. These videos are really, really good. I really like them. Cheyanne is more on Alexa's side than I am able to be in this video, but at the time with the information that we had, I was pretty much in lockstep with their read on it. I hope that they don't mind me telling you to watch their video in a video where I'm coming to other conclusions, but just the fact that I'm coming to a different conclusion than the one that Cheyanne had a few months ago when they made this video, I don't think discredits anything, even if they do have a different read on Alexa's current behavior than I do. Like I said, at the time I was in Camp Alexa, and that's pretty much Cheyanne's take in the video as well. All of that information is like good nuance background to have because I'm covering some of it, but I'm coming at this in a different angle, obviously, so point is, if you've seen those, or if you pause this right now and then go watch them, you'll have a little bit more background for what I mean when I say that Podco seems to have become very corporate. Information that you would have from those videos, though, if you have, is that Allison Stoner's podcast, Dear Hollywood, was originally going to be distributed by Podco. Again, Podco founded by Christy Carlson Romano, who seems to have been boss-babing a whole empire of other former stars making podcasts about the content that they were once on. So this Ned's Declassified tangent is kind of about a lot of different Podco things because it's complicated. I maybe should be in the nuance corner for this. So this tangent is about the Ned's Declassified podcast, but the Ned's Declassified podcast explicitly kind of seems to exist as a result of Christy Carlson Romano. The Ned's Declassified podcast, as I said before, is just generally a weird vibe. It wants to be a laid-back, unprofessional, hanging out with your friends show. It wants to be a serious talk about traumas and growth and personal accountability show. It wants to be a cash-in on clickbait about former child stars show. I think it pretty firmly has situated itself as being goofy and silly and not that deep, and that's what makes them keep getting comfortable enough to put their foot in their mouth in ways we'll be getting back around to. But also, there is something a little bit inherently invalidating about the way that they go around that at times, because they're holding these two very dissonant things in what they're saying. The message of the Ned's Declassified podcast is at times, wow, fame was a really hard and challenging thing to struggle with, and at times, man, that was the time of my life when I was a child star. And I'm sure that that's also what the reality of having been a child star is. I'm not saying that somebody has to renounce their entire past and regret every moment that they spent as a child star. But I do think that you kind of lose your credibility in commenting on other people's trauma once you've been so clear that that trauma is not your perspective on what you've experienced. However, Yeah, the Ned's Declassified cast says that their set was not traumatizing. I'm not interested in, like, assigning speculation of whatever. I am saying, though, was it not traumatizing? Even though they don't identify it as trauma, and I'm not saying that this negligence was inherently traumatic, because I think there's a difference in how you interpret things, and sometimes something that could be deeply traumatizing to one person isn't to somebody else. But a lot of the stories that are told and that circulate from this podcast seem to still point to a pretty severe amount of negligence, even on the set of shows that weren't participating in the Dan Schneider brand of sexualization of its teen cast. I'm not really getting into a lot of that here, but, like, even things that are just passed around as innocuous clickbait. I mean, stuff's gonna happen when you have teenagers on set, but also, why wasn't anybody making sure that these children weren't, like, hooking up with each other? Why was it apparently not a problem when the guy who played Jade's boyfriend in Victoria said that he was, like, drunk and high every day when they were filming? Why didn't anybody have those regulations? Even if the child on set, or very young adult in the case, I guess, of the later seasons of Victorious, enjoyed that, it still doesn't mean that it was a situation that the child should have been put in. And holding yourself both as, well, I wasn't traumatized, but it was really cool, does a little bit undermine what other people are saying, which is why this constant tone shifting between we're being serious, no, we're joking around, no, take us seriously, ha ha ha, it's so funny, is just, like, hard to sit with. I think that that's not a critique of the podcast or the people running the podcast as being unsafe or irresponsible, though, because their fan base isn't a collective of vulnerable people who feel like they're financially supporting a movement. The Ned's Declassified cast is making entertainment, and entertainment that I don't personally really enjoy, but also that really isn't made for me. I'm not a podcast listener, and by the numbers, I don't like most podcasts, so it's not weird that I don't like this one. But, like, inherently, that is a different thing. And even though they do sometimes want to step their toes into being taken seriously and talking about serious topics, that doesn't seem to be a major focus of the Ned's Declassified rewatch show the way it is of, say, Eat Predators. Or if, like, the people from Ned's Declassified were having a different child star every week on to talk about things that are, you know, vulnerable. Christy Carlson Romano's fingerprints are all over this. So Christy Carlson Romano, like I said, even if you don't know that name, you probably know her. She was the voice of Kim Possible. She played Ren in Even Stevens. She was that lesbian in Cadet Kelly. She's been in a lot of things for Disney over the years, and she's been very, very careful and intentional about the way she's spoken about them after the fact. There's more evidence of this in those videos by Cheyanne pointing out that Christy is first and foremost a capitalist. She is approaching this from a capitalist way, so is the Ned's Declassified cast. In both of those circumstances, I do kind of criticize them less than I'm criticizing what Alexa is putting forward, but it's also because I'm holding them to a much less high standard and also do not personally like them. The truth is, just opening yourself up as an activist collection, an organization, a movement, makes you inherently more necessary to be critiqued than just some random podcast channel. I definitely wouldn't classify what Christy Carlson Romano does on Vulnerable as a movement or an activist collective. I think she sometimes inches closer and closer as if that's what she wants credit for, but she doesn't quite grab for it the same way we see out of Alexa. Stay with me if you think that was too mean, I'm sorry. So, Christy has the Vulnerable podcast on which she has different child stars coming on and talking about their stories and their experiences. Christy has tried a bunch of different outlets to regather her notoriety from the Disney Channel days, but doesn't have like a Disney Plus reboot yet the way that like Raven does. Christy has also been outspoken about the fact that she wouldn't put like her own children into the show business industry. She doesn't think that it's a good place for kids. She seems to want to be very cooperative with Allison Stoner when it suits Christy to be cooperative with Allison Stoner on the things that Allison Stoner is trying to do for the industry and children working in it, but she's not really pushing herself as an activist. I would say Christy Carlson Romano is trying to do more of like a Drew Barrymore thing, and that's fine. I love Drew Barrymore. I know that Drew Barrymore also has had critiques against her, though, on her takes on some things or her kind of neutrality on things. I know she did a segment where she was very highly praising the troubled teen industry lockup that she was forced into by her parents and still giving it credit as something that had saved her and solved her. And I think everybody is allowed to process what they went through at their own pace. And while I don't discredit survivors who have opinions about that, I do discredit people like me who didn't live through that, who think that they have any kind of stance on whether or not Drew Barrymore acts like that was appropriately traumatizing to her. It doesn't change the fact that it was traumatizing to her, and it is traumatizing to the children who are locked up in those facilities all over the place all the time. Drew Barrymore, though, has other strengths. She may not directly call a spade when it comes to TTI industry lockups like that being legalized child torture, but she does have a really good way of connecting with other former child stars who may or may not have similar levels of understanding or not having processed yet the trauma of what they've been through. Also, importantly, I don't see Drew Barrymore referring to herself as an activist. I think she's hosting a talk show, and that's kind of also what Christy is doing. I don't know that Christy even would find that characterization of it bad. I think if Christy Carlson Romano could take Vulnerable onto TV, she would in a heartbeat. But I also just think that that informs the kind of content that she's making in a way that it doesn't inform what Alexa does. So because of that, oh man, these two butt heads. Before I really dig into that second notable beef, though, I do want to move back to the origins of Eat Predators and that podcast that I was talking about earlier. Because now that we've already seen some of the way that Alexa responded to having been mentioned on the Ned's Declassified podcast, I want to talk about some other ways that she has publicized her narrative on things, and let's see where we land on that. We'll come back to Christy Carlson Romano and more public beef after that, but I want to kind of lay some groundwork for why this hypocrisy that we're building up to with what we see with the Drake Beldarvo campaign isn't fully shocking, and I feel like we do need to look at how she interacted with people who weren't famous celebrities, who she called out in similar manners on her podcast. So let's move all the way back to that origin that we were talking about earlier of Eat Predators. This podcast has Kaylee Higgins and Kay Brown. Like I said, I'm not using parts of this that I feel like rely too heavily on what Shift was saying due to the fact that there has been legal action brought against Shift. But I also do want to talk about what I find to be a pretty intentional overstatement of harm so that you know why I was kind of running the math the way that I was and decided to use this podcast anyway. So we're going to be talking about Alexa's smear campaign against the women in this podcast, but first I do want to tell you a story about something that she referred to on her podcast as being threatened with a gun. She doesn't actually say threatened with a gun, she says GUN because she doesn't say words for algorithmic purposes, but I don't subscribe to that, so I'd love it if you would subscribe to me, because this video might not get pushed as heavily since I'm using words. But anyway, I want to say that I understand having kind of a paranoid reading on everything once you feel like somebody was being threatened. And like I said before, I do take issue with some of Schiff's actions. I do think that the behavior exhibited, for example, in some of the live streams where they were continuing to go to Eat Predators protests is not effective or helpful, and I understand how it may have contributed to Alexa feeling unsafe. However, I do think it is a pretty intentional overstatement of harm to refer to the meme of the guy pointing a gun at the screen and says, "You're a leftist, name everybody who has left you," and say that that was posted as a direct threat to you because you were named in the list of people who had recently left the person posting the meme. The things that I saw Shift saying were like, "I'm not going to let them forget about me. I'm going to come over here. You can't push me off into the margins. I'm not going to shut up." I didn't see things on the stream that made the gun in that image feel to me like a threat. And honestly, Alexa's credibility in my eyes, hearing her mobilize her audience about that, shot down by quite a bit. I'm not saying that because I think that Shift didn't do anything wrong or because I think that the court was wrong in granting at least a temporary restraining order. I'm not commenting as far as that is concerned, but I do think it is very normal to act like every mean thing that somebody says to you is a death threat, and that intentionally overstating that harm to rile people up on your behalf is not great. Again, the context of the meme was that Shift had been volunteering for Eat Predators and was fired after having been in like the inner circle for at least a few days. That he posted, among other things, on his profile a photo that is a meme that I have seen posted by my friends, not as a threat, just because it's a goofy meme. "You're a leftist, name everybody who left you." To classify that as somebody pointing a gun at the camera and telling you specifically to name everybody who left you is I don't like it. I'm trying to state all of this very delicately. I really don't want to get sued, but I also think that that's fair for me to make speculations about. I'm not speculating that Alexa did not feel genuinely unsafe. I'm not saying that I wouldn't feel unsafe in a similar situation with somebody behaving towards me in similar ways. I'm just saying that this particular meme is in the restraining order, and it's something that she references later on without showing the image. Because the image is pretty obviously a joke. I'm not saying it's a good joke, I'm not saying it's a joke she had to agree with or laugh at, but I am saying that I don't think that it was a death threat, and that overstating the harm by characterizing it as such is irresponsible. Irresponsibility, though, does seem to be a really large part of the story of the beginning of Eat Predators. So let's get into what I learned from watching that podcast. It took me a while to decide how I wanted to talk about this Good Morning Mayberry podcast. Again, I've already crammed a ton of nuance into why I'm even using it. But the reason that it feels so important to mention in terms of this narrative that's being constructed as we take a look at Alexa's actions is that Alexa herself responded to it. Now, I don't immediately think that the fact that she responded to this is inappropriate, right? Somebody was putting out their version of the origin of Eat Predators. The title of the podcast is The Real and True Origins of Eat Predators. Alexa titled her stream about it like the factual receipt-driven evidence of Eat Predators or something to that effect. I'll put it on screen. But that wasn't the first time that she had given her account of the beginnings of Eat Predators. And the first time that she gave the account was much sooner to the release of the podcast date. I'm not sure if there was like some legal stuff that made her wait and make sure she was covered to respond to it the way she did. Maybe it was a Miranda sings, they didn't say I couldn't sing situation. Like maybe they didn't tell her specifically. Maybe don't put all of these people on like a big public humiliation campaign the way that you do with famous predators, because it muddies your impact and your image. But the lawyers didn't tell her not to do that, apparently, because that's what she did. So I didn't pay attention to the Guess Who streams in the weeks that they were coming out and being talked about on Twitter, even though I did follow Alexa on Twitter. I'm gonna have to unfollow her after this because I keep seeing more things the more days it takes me to make this video, and I'm like, eventually one of these new updates is going to be something that I would be stuck waiting for weeks to update on again. So I don't know if I'll be talking about Alexa again in the future. If the way that she keeps acting up is just more of the same in this video, I really don't see myself continuing to cover. Like I said, this isn't a takedown video. I'm just noticing some things about her that are making me question what kind of platform she should be perceived as having. Not whether or not she should have a platform at all, but just if what she's doing actually matches up with what she's telling us she's doing. Does that make sense? I'm not saying I don't make like videos just for the sake of recapping some like internet drama. I think I might make a video about Caroline Calloway next. Because if Alexa were just doing a Caroline Calloway, I wouldn't care. I say that to mean I would have a really different taste in my mouth about these big exposing your ex-friends streams if they were being done by somebody who we were only supposed to accept as like an influencer girly who can get away with making highly derivative art and selling it for too much and having public beef that people take big sides in. Speaking of which, I also want to make it clear when I say beef, I have sorted very specific things into the beef category. I am in no way referring to things that are actively traumatic as beef. I don't think any of these things that I have sorted into that category quite fit that way for one reason or another. I don't think beef suits a lot of the interpersonal conflicts that we're talking about and ones that we're not talking about in this video. I wouldn't use beef to describe Alexa and Dan Schneider's history. I only use it to describe Britney Spears and Alexa's history because now Britney Spears has been so publicly forgiven by her that it's like an ex beef. But I don't think that being yelled at by Britney Spears as a child wouldn't have been traumatizing. You know what I mean? I just want to make sure that it's clear that I've been thoughtful about that because I might have a bad taste in my mouth if I was still an Alexa fan and somebody kept being like, this is petty beef. This thing that I'm talking about right now, I am not referring to as beef. The thing with Lindsay was beef. This is something else, and it's something that I'm not entirely sure what to call. The Guess Who streams are not exactly doxing, but they're also not really not doxing. Thinking about it in these terms, right? Like this podcast is such a tiny, tiny affair, the one that Kay and Kaylee were on. At the time of me recording this video, it's at about 1,000 views, and it's been up for over a year now, and also publicly been responded to by Alexa, so probably had much less views before she had her own podcast about the origins of Eat Predators, although she does not link to this podcast or mention it as an impetus for what she's doing. I am inferring that it's a response to the podcast because over the series of the open letter that she had originally written when she gave everybody pseudonyms that are now revoked because they've made her angry enough, and the Guess Who stream viewing event spectacle for her audience, she addresses a lot of the same things that are brought up in there. So she didn't directly say, this is my response to the Good Morning Mayberry podcast. Probably because she would have had to watch little bits of it at a time, the way that she does when she responds to Ned's Declassified or something. And nobody is actually saying the things that she wants to react as if they're saying. Stay with me here. If you watched Alexa's Guess Who series and her talking about the origins of Eat Predators and all of this infighting among survivors who were being divided. You would have heard her tell a story that says that the people who are out there talking poorly about her and trying to distance her from her own movement said that Eat Predators was the idea of a man. That's plenty off-putting, right? Especially if you're already in Camp Alexa. But I listened to that podcast. Nobody said it was a man's idea. I heard what I told you earlier. A bunch of different activists and like women in the industry were individually protesting. They connected each other to the same lawyer who had been working with them individually. At some point, according to this podcast, that lawyer said, you guys should just combine forces and start protesting together instead of just doing your own thing. Nowhere in the podcast do they say that Alexa was not part of the formation of Eat Predators. They don't say that she wasn't a driving force behind the way that they organized for the original Diplo protest or anything that follows it. In fact, the fact that she was such a driving force is kind of the issue. Nobody was divorcing her from credit, and it only takes away credit from Alexa for starting Eat Predators if it also takes away credit from everybody else who also was organizing before Eat Predators and gives it to that man, which I don't think it does. I don't think anybody said it was the entire brainchild and would not exist without a lawyer. The statement that's being made is a bunch of different people were probably all giving a lawyer a bunch of really similar cases, and he tried to consolidate the amount of work that he had to do about it. This lawyer wasn't being hailed as a hero or an activist. It was a way that a bunch of people met each other, which is how organizations start. The credit for the beginning of an organization isn't the one person who did the most at the original meeting. Everybody who organized together typically gets to share in that like foundational role of it. Alexa is very, very protective of the idea of Eat Predators as hers, as her being the founder. She says she was the one who came up with the Eat Predators motif. She even doesn't dispute that it was because of the Eat the Rich, Eat Predators. Like, it's not a huge intellectual property thing, and even if she did have opinions about things being big intellectual property, you would think that her signs and art would be more original than they are, and they're not, and we're getting back to that. But I want to stay on focus when I'm talking about overstatement of harm, because what a way to get people not to listen to the other feminists who are organizing in the same space, right? For reference here, Alexa's husband also doesn't seem to have any prior activist or organizational space or anything experience when it comes to this. But he's a producer on her podcast. He's there sometimes to do voiceovers and do like that streamer thing I don't really understand, where they'll be like, W, let's go, welcome to the munchies. So from your comfortable vantage point, making money from a podcast out of something that was supposed to be protests, you get to sit there and throw stones at a woman for saying something she didn't say because you figured out how to frame it as her giving a man credit for your idea. A man getting credit for idea is like immediate rile up button. Alexa knows where the rile up buttons are. That's why she doesn't refer to that "you're a leftist" meme as the guy from American Psycho. She refers to it as a man pointing a gun at my name. She refers to it as a death threat. That's why she doesn't say, oh, they mentioned that there were also other women doing this before me and that we all got involved together. Because it's much, much easier to get people to mobilize behind you when the claim that you're making is that fired up. Nobody said that a man started Eat Predators. But because of the soft doxing format of these Guess Who streams, even things that I didn't directly hear from Kay and Kaylee in the podcast, things I was just seeing from screenshots Alexa was sharing that seemed to show her side, I still did not find them to be discredited. So, in the early days of Eat Predators, Kay and Kaylee were really concerned about responding to emails from survivors who were reaching out to them. That's mentioned as something that they still, at the time of recording the podcast, like felt bad that there are vulnerable people who are still reaching out to this organization that is not accredited or really prepared to equip them with the right resources. Allegedly, when they were telling Alexa that it was too much work for them to be doing for free full time to continue responding to all of these emails, she was surprised that they had been responding in the first place. She said, "Oh, just don't write back. We're not a survivor hotline," allegedly. And it's fine to know what you are and what your limitations are, but also if you are explaining yourself to the public as a collective, a group of activists, an organization, people are going to expect you to want to provide resources to people who are reaching out for you. And the resources that are being provided are resources that are not helpful to the survivors. They're resources that are helpful to the organization, which is not really how being a nonprofit works. And Alexa knows that because Eat Predators is not a nonprofit. But at first, it was going to be. There was discussion around that. People wanted it to be. Because Alexa doesn't take a second to think through the implications of this in the Guess Who live streams where she's complaining about this, she says, "I just felt like I was being pressured. This movement was still a baby in its infancy, and I didn't know what shape I wanted it to take." But why do you think people who were putting in full-time hours for this work wanted it to be incorporated as a nonprofit? Because pretty obvious immediately if you have ever worked for a nonprofit or know anybody who has worked for a nonprofit, they do have to pay at least some wages. Like, I'm not saying you get super rich from working at a nonprofit, but you still have to pay your employees. And by incorporating as a nonprofit, you are eligible for grants and funds that can help you do that while you're getting on your feet. So by not prioritizing turning into a nonprofit, Alexa kind of stoked some, I think, completely understandable hesitation in the other people who were organizing with her. Because suddenly this avenue that could have been used to make this into something that meant more than just Alexa could support themselves off of it, it's turning into something else. And at the same time as she is dragging her feet on incorporating it as a nonprofit, the focus of Eat Predators also begins to shift. There's a cultural movement, really. Jeanette McCurdy's memoir, I'm Glad My Mom Died, came out, and interest in what's really going on behind the scenes at Nickelodeon skyrocketed. This is something that was already building in public interest for a few years, and Jeanette McCurdy, although her book is not even largely about that, has become a face of this movement. I am classifying Jeanette and Alexa as a one-sided beef on Alexa's part, and we're going to get to it later. But it's also kind of like it's just, we're going to get to it. We're going to get to it. Have faith in me. But because of the public interest around Nickelodeon after the memoir, the focus of Eat Predators really shifted and became more about Nickelodeon, like I said before, not just in terms of what was being covered, but also the protests began to be about Nickelodeon. And the first time that they protested at Nickelodeon, they got press coverage because, of course, they did. Even in the messages that Alexa shows, where she's trying to show how horrible and awful these people are, they were saying it's understandable that the press singled Alexa out as the figurehead of the movement. But just like the Ned's Declassified podcast wants to have it both ways, Alexa wants to have it both ways. She wants to be a collective of activists and survivors. She wants to be an organization. She wants to have the numbers that make people take you more seriously than if you're just a YouTube channel. But she also wants this to be hers. She wants to be Eat Predators. She wants everybody to immediately think of Alexa. I mean, I used this same graphic earlier, but look at the way that Eat Predators is described in the opening sentences about it on the website. And also, look at this focus on merch. So in these live streams, in part of her trying to humiliate these people for asking her, I think very kindly, if there was a future where they could make money if they continued to do this full time, she says that one of the reasons that she doesn't want to incorporate as a nonprofit is because she has recently learned about the Guerrilla Girls, and that's what she wants to do, and the Guerrilla Girls were not a nonprofit. And that's true. The Guerrilla Girls were feminists and artists and activists. They weren't a nonprofit. They also were not a merch factory or a trashy gossip podcast. So I think that argument falls a little bit flat. The Guerrilla Girls protested specifically around visibility of women in the arts. I honestly think this is probably a little bit of a pretentious feminist opinion of me. I was a little bit surprised to see somebody who had already for years been composing themselves as a public feminist be surprised by the existence of the Guerrilla Girls, but apparently reading the Guerrilla Girls inspired Alexa to focus instead on her artivism. Along with the focus on the artivism came pushing more merch. It seems to largely be limited collection pushes for now, but I think there are some things that are available full time. If this were just some regular podcast with bad merch, I wouldn't even be mentioning this. But the way that they market this merch is so goddamn insidious that I have to. Yeah, okay. By wearing this, you show that you're safe. That is, that. You can't just do that. Like, I understand the appeal. I understand the whole, like, post Donald Trump, wear a safety pin so people know you're safe. Like, I'm not bashing people who want to have something that shows that they're, like, a safe person. Think about the difference, though, in, like, what a you can pee next to me pin does compared to something that's, like, punish bad guys. Right? And this is a commodification of activism that I think is a really thorough through line with both Alexa and Christy. Again, like I said, these two butt heads because they're so similar. They're both profiting off of this trauma, and it's something that Alexa thinks that she's exempt from because she's not doing it in a way that she's trying to get on TV for. But make no mistake here, Alexa very much is courting a fandom and a fan base. She doesn't want a fan base, though, of people who enjoyed her in season 1 of Zoe 101. She wants a fan base made up of traumatized people who see her as their hero and their advocate. And she has driven away anybody who can give any kind of accountability that advocates actually need to have in what they're doing. Because really think about what those Guess Who streams do. Think of what they accomplish other than the soft doxing of activists in the same space as you. Like how that might have opened some of those people up to attacks, not just from people in your fan base, but also from people who hate you too and want to know about what other feminist organizations they can go spew hate at, and you're only mentioning them in a negative light. Alexa said multiple times over the course of this stream series that she does not think that the organizations that these other people work with are safe for survivors. If that's an acceptable critique for her to make of other groups, it's an acceptable critique for me to make of Eat Predators, and it's the one I'm making right now. In the stream the other night, addressing the most recent Ned's Declassified gossip rumor bullshit thing, Alexa said, and I didn't realize how much this upset me until I started talking about it, but Alexa said that a good apology can compete with years of therapy. And no, it fucking cannot. An apology changes nothing. It changes nothing about what happened. It doesn't inherently change whether or not the offender will continue to reoffend. Therapy changes your response to what happened. It changes your response to similar things that might happen in the future, and it helps you to lay boundaries so that you're not in those positions in the future, potentially, where people are going to be that shitty to you that you would require a big apology. No apology competes with years of therapy. Saying that as just a random podcast really would not make me this upset. Saying it as somebody who is trying to be a leader in a space absolutely bothers me. Apologies are good for interpersonal relationships, but Alexa's brand of activism is to demand private and public apologies both, but now increasingly with a focus on the private one first for reasons I'm gonna speculate on in a bit, and that apologies can compete with therapy. Think for a second about how much more bleak your worldview is if apology is the solution and not restoration. If someone's sorry enough, they don't have to deal with actually growing. That's what this leads to. That's what this whole video leads to. That's why I got tipped off about this mindset being so bad in the first place. Because not only is not everybody going to apologize, or not everybody going to apologize up to your standards, or maybe they will apologize and then when you realize that it doesn't fix what happened, you retroactively change your standards because a better apology would have obviously fixed this. But also, there are just an infinite amount of things that you can run around forever demanding apologies for. And people are still going to be perpetuating things that they have apologized for in the past if the apology is the focus and not the circumstances leading to the thing happening. It's like that story of the two people come across a bunch of babies floating downstream in a river. One of them runs in and starts pulling babies out of the river, and the other one runs even further upstream to where somebody is like tossing them from the orphanage into the river or whatever. I don't really understand this parable. Even that doesn't really count because like the lady pulling babies out of the river is like still helping those individual people, but like systemically the focus on the apology is just worthless. It's less worthless than pulling babies out of the river because you have one person pulling babies out of the river and then the other person is saying, can you publicly tell me that you're sorry that you're throwing babies into the river? Are you maybe throwing babies into the river because you're recycling some of your own trauma? I'm sorry for the fake crying voice, but I have to get across somehow that that happens all the time in Eat Predators streams, but I'm trying to be very selective of which clips I use. But it's an overstatement of harm that having wanted to get paid meant only being in it for the money, especially when increasingly the focus is the artivism. And again, back to the Caroline Calloway-ification of activism, I wouldn't typically make value judgments like this on either protest signs or shitty podcast merch. It's specifically the fact that you can't be a protest sign and also good art necessarily. There's protest art, but protest signs are a lot more able to be quickly fashioned together. Using existing iconography in a protest sign is good and like the standard practice because it is attention getting. Using existing iconography in merch is lazy. And I wouldn't really care about lazy merch other than the fact that, again, it's being packaged as something that buying is doing an activism. You are doing an activism by wearing this ugly shirt. And also, I hate the logo. Am I far enough into the video to say that? I feel like everybody who really loves Alexa has already left. I don't like the logo. I don't think it's cute. I think it is actually weirdly sexualized. That might be a hot take, but I think it is both ugly and weirdly sexual for something that's supposed to be about sexual violence. I don't know. I would probably just have never said that out loud if it was simply a cringe thing. Like, most of these posters are just kind of cringy, but like, also some of them are blatant rips of existing feminist iconography. Existing feminist iconography that I'm like, not sure actually backs up this streamer version of activism. The focus on artivism meant that they stopped protesting weekly and started protesting monthly. Protesting is still good, but selling shirts is not protesting. And increasingly, because I think the argument could be made that an Eat Predators protest is a pop up for the podcast, they're conflating the two things. Wear this incredibly, incredibly ugly shirt so that everybody knows that you are safe to be around if you are in the traumatized people fandom. I just don't think anybody was trying to take Eat Predators away from Alexa. I think once they realized that this was always going to be something that Alexa was the primary face on, they just wanted to know if eventually anybody else would benefit from that. And the answer seems to have been no. And as a result of publicly humiliating these people for expecting any kind of like industry standard to be followed by something that was presenting itself like it wanted to at some point turn into a nonprofit, they've run off the chance of anybody else wanting to associate with them who has any kind of credibility or business sense. People who would have been able to help them get grants so that they could make a larger impact in the life of more survivors than just specifically Alexa. In the most recent stream that I caught of Eat Predators Daily, she did say not even Survivor Run Collective, but Survivor Run YouTube channel, and I was like, yeah, good job. That's what it is. That's also what a lot of other YouTube channels are. Anything more from that to describe this out of me gets increasingly exhausting. And in case I haven't already established to you why that is, let's talk more about Christy Carlson Romano and Alexa and Corey Feldman. Okay, genuinely did not think it would take me that long to get to notable beef number 2, but Alexa Nikolas versus Christy Carlson Romano. This one is a little bit less straightforward than the beef between her and Lindsay. Like I said before, you know what Christy Carlson Romano does on her Vulnerable podcast. So when I say Alexa went on the Vulnerable podcast, you have a pretty good idea, right? Like, they talked about her history, her traumatic experiences working at Nickelodeon, and the advocacy work that she was starting to do at the time, because this was early into Eat Predators within the industry. A few months after the fact, Christy Carlson Romano, expanding her Rolodex of former Child Star guest lists, has Corey Feldman on the pod. Now, important context here, although I'm not moving back to the nuance corner because I just got on the bed. Corey Feldman is Drake Bell. Not literally, but like, this story that I'm telling you, I want you to already know that if you don't already. I'm telling you a story where Alexa got really mad at somebody, but in this story, they are behaving the exact way that she was. What do I mean when I say Corey Feldman is Drake Bell? I mean, Corey Feldman has detailed a pretty extensive and horrific history of child abuse as a child actor, and also has victimized other people who have come forward and made allegations about his behavior after the fact. The friend of one of those people, somebody who knows a victim of Corey Feldman, right? They emailed Christy Carlson Romano to be like, hey, you're talking about survivor advocacy. You probably want to know about these allegations that your guest star has against him. Christy did not respond to that message from the friend of somebody who was victimized by Corey Feldman. that friend reached out to Alexa and said, Alexa, I tried to tell Christy Carlson Romano about this. I can't believe she's having Corey Feldman on her podcast. And Alexa, the way that she had previously, up to a recent point we haven't yet gotten to, and definitely during this story, took the side of the victim. She did not think that Christy Carlson Romano should be platforming Corey Feldman. And she attempted to reach out to Christy to say the same and did not get responded to. For context's sake, this is all really close to the same time as that Ned's Declassified drama that we were just talking about. So Christy, at some point during all of this, blocked Alexa because Alexa was tagging her in things and messaging her and asking for a response. Alexa's mind was, I'm advocating on behalf of these survivors who don't want to have to see their antagonizer on a podcast talking about how hard his life is, right? Saying it in these terms sounds even more calculated than I necessarily think it is, but Alexa got a lot of content out of this. She streamed about it multiple times. She reacted to the vulnerable episode that Christy Carlson Romano had Corey Feldman on to talk about things. And predictably, in that podcast episode on the show where people come to talk about their trauma, Corey Feldman also launched a bit of obfuscation about the things that are alleged about him. He used the opportunity to be on Christy's podcast to be like, well, if you look at my Wikipedia, it's full of stuff that's not true. That sucks. But also, like the point that I made at the end of my Drake Bell video, that's what happens when you brand yourself so heavily as a safe space. People who have nefarious intentions for what they're going to do, maybe when they're in that safe space, immediately start to try to put in their teeth, their claws, their hooks. People who might have had prior organizational experience and known ways to get things under control and like handled in more delicate ways, or seen warning signs of people who are using them for nefarious ends, in the case of Eat Predators, are nowhere to be seen. And in the case of Vulnerable, again, I think Corey Feldman's interview is shitty. I think it's pretty obvious what he's trying to do, and I don't like it. Do I think necessarily that Christy Carlson Romano had a moral obligation not to put Corey Feldman on the podcast? Maybe not. I mean, I wouldn't sit down and have a buddy-buddy conversation with somebody who I knew had the kind of allegations against him that Corey Feldman have, and also would not want to normalize that. But also, again, it's a talk show that Christy Carlson Romano is doing. It's very different from what Alexa does or presents herself as doing. And also, Alexa made her stance on this impeccably clear over the course of this. She felt like Christy Carlson Romano had clickbaited her trauma, Alexa's trauma, and characterized it as such months after having agreed to be on the podcast and having signed off on the episode that was originally aired. And I do understand the feeling of, okay, this makes the context of me appearing on this different than what I thought I was signing on to. But also similar to therapy proving that you can change your response to things and not other things that happen, right? You are in control over your appearance on a show. The things that you said, even, making sure that they didn't edit you in a way that was misleading and they didn't do like an I think Coolsville sucks thing. You don't continue to have ownership over the project moving forward, however that makes you feel in one direction or another. But Alexa felt very much like, as she was being looked to as somebody who was going to solve this issue, that she had not just a right, but like a responsibility, a moral obligation to tell Christy Carlson Romano that what she was doing was wrong. And the way that Alexa did that was by pointing herself in such diametric opposition to Christy. Again, though, what do I keep skirting around here with this Drake Bell thing, right?
because the release of Quiet on Set happened quite a bit into the focus of Eat Predators shifting to Nickelodeon, but it coincided with the fact that the unknown victim of the Brian Peck sexual assault claim that was well known with an anonymous victim was Drake Bell. Drake Bell, like Corey Feldman, is both a victim and a perpetrator. Neither of these men's status as a victim, I think, actually legitimately informs their status as a perpetrator, because being a victim does not make you turn around and do things to other people. Pretending like it does discredits the work that can actually be done in restorative justice to make people not continue to reperpetuate patterns of harm. But also, not everybody who got entangled into a pattern of harm they didn't ask for turns around and does that again the next time that they have a chance. Drake Bell and Corey Feldman both exist both as victims and perpetrators. I think perpetrator might actually be more helpful language to use than predator, because a victim can't be a predator and a predator can't be a victim, but a victim can perpetrate. And that's what we've seen in both the case of Corey Feldman and in Drake Bell. But what makes Drake Bell different, right? Because if you clicked on this video because you already have a discomfort with Alexa's recent actions, you already know this, but Alexa has become very breathless and empathetic coverage of Drake Bell ever since the release of Quiet on Set and the media frenzy leading up to it that revealed that Drake Bell was the unnamed victim. She has gotten a lot of pushback for this, and she, like Christy did when she was getting people pushing back on her for featuring Corey Feldman on her podcast, seems to have been blocking people on Twitter as a result of it, not hearing them out, not reporting on pieces of evidence that are being brought forward to her. I mentioned this in my last video. She is now claiming that she has all of the documents from the court trial pertaining to Drake Bell. This is untrue, or at least not true in the way that she's presenting it. All of the records that haven't been sealed at Drake's request are publicly available. We also have video footage of his sentencing. Video footage that Alexa previously reacted to and said she stood with the victim during. Alexa's hard line in the sand, this thing that was making her so combative with Christy Carlson Romano, this nuance that she did not extend to Corey Feldman as both a victim and a perpetrator, is suddenly miles and miles high, building walls of protection around Drake Bell. She deleted her previous video where she reacted to the sentencing, and now she's saying that she has more documents pertaining to the case that she's going to go over. Apparently not from the victim, so what is she seeing? And the things that are being circulated about Drake Bell already are like that there's this big smoking gun and evidence and witnesses who said that she lied, and that's not true. Nobody was cross-examined. Nobody has gone under oath and made statements about this. Whatever we have of he said, she said isn't even he said, she said. It's she said, Drake Bell's lawyer said. I know everybody got really used to typing out, just watch the case, because they really liked those girl boss Camilla Johnny Depp lawyer compilations or whatever, but watching it does not change the fact that there's not mountains and mountains of evidence and testimony in this case, and that it's because your boy said he did it. He pled guilty. Think for a second about how many people do not see any level of justice in the court system, and think about how airtight the case must have been for him to think that not fighting it was the better move once he knew that there was press coverage involved. Because what was the better move? The better move was to lie low, move to Portugal or whatever, and then frame that in the documentary as I've never moved to Mexico, without being clear about where you've been or what you've been doing. And then start a PR push. And that's what we're in the middle of. I took a nap after the most recent Christy Carlson segment, and let's see how my strategy of just staying up and finishing filming tonight pays off, or if we get another outfit change in this video, huh? A lot of these notable beefs that were coming up, I'm gonna kind of breeze through because I truly feel like you get the picture by now. But the most nuanced one out of all of them probably is notable beef number 3 between Alexa and the Spears sisters. Like I said before, if Alexa had not already received an apology, potentially the apology she's referring to as being honestly quite as helpful as years of therapy or whatever it is, I wouldn't have categorized this in beef. I would have just kind of left it as part of the trauma that Alexa experienced from working at Nickelodeon. But they're on good terms now because Alexa is even mentioned in Britney's book. Britney said that she told Alexa to tell Nickelodeon to kiss her ass. As I previously mentioned, though, Britney Spears did yell at Alexa when she was a child, and I do think that that would have been really scary and traumatizing, especially with the inherent power imbalance with Britney Spears having been a big pop star and you are a secondary character on her little sister's show. That's where the Jamie Lynn thing comes in. Jamie Lynn played Zoe on Zoe 101. So when there was interpersonal conflict between the two of them, Zoe, Jamie Lynn, was more important to the network and the people making decisions in the room to keep happy. Again, nothing about this video should be taken to discredit any allegations Alexa has made. As I've said, this all sounds horrible, but it is something worth knowing if you're trying to have as complete of a history about Alexa as you can. She had a terrible time on set of Zoe 101. She says that she was bullied by pretty much all of the cast members, either while she was on set or afterwards, as a result of them either speaking out against her or, being in the Zoe 102 reboot movie thing that she was not invited to be part of. I mentioned Quentin reviews in my Drake Bell video, and I'm going to reference him again here because he summed all of this up in a way that I think is really succinct. This is teenager drama where teenagers were acting like teenagers and the adults in the room should have behaved like adults. If Jamie Lynn was mean to her, that sucks, but it doesn't sound like the bullying that she experienced was anywhere on the same level of the kind of systemic harm that happens to child actors when it comes to specifically what her peers were doing. And I say that because there are some behaviors Alexa has exhibited online after the fact that also do kind of come across as bullying, not just to her ex-cast members on Zoe 101, which, whatever. I have nuance for Lindsay saying Alexa is out there spouting out into the universe, then I also have nuance for Alexa tweeting a picture of her and Jamie Lynn and being like, we have the same birthday, but thank God not the same personality. But you do lose a little bit of high ground the more you engage in those things. And you lose a lot of high ground when you engage in other behaviors like that towards people who aren't even cast members with you on a show that you used to be on. I'm not putting this in my video. One, because these people I don't think consented to have their photos used this way. Two, I don't really get the joke. Like, it's literally like in Lilo and Stitch when she's like taking pictures of the fat tourists. Like, it's not an evolved or healed mindset. And again, it's from several years ago, so I wouldn't hold the fact that it exists against her, but I do hold the fact that she has to be aware that people are circulating them again, and she hasn't gone back and taken them down, which tells me that because these are literally just making fun of people's body, anything that she's said to do with like body positivity or being feminist in that particular intersection didn't come from a true understanding of how she had maybe exhibited some of that in the past. I just don't want to put that shit in my video, so I'm not going to.
It doesn't feel right, like, at all that we're on tangent number 2 this far into the video. But, like, I checked my outline versus what I was going to say, and this is the first time I've gotten back to a tangent since we were talking about Ned's and Christy. Weird. I probably did some math wrong somewhere. I was homeschooled, but we're continuing like this is tangent number 2. The corporatization of Podco. Like I said, I mentioned this earlier. Allison Stoner's podcast, Dear Hollywood, originally was going to be distributed by Podco. In the first episode of Allison's podcast, though, they tell a story about how they had recorded all but the final episode of their podcast, and they were editing it themselves. They had been the ones to reach out to their own personal contacts of former child stars to do interviews with. This was their intellectual property, but at some point the legal team from Podco switched.
I actually wrote and recorded Dear Hollywood over a year ago, and I interviewed really special guests for it, but I can't release it.
Again, this was entirely Allison's work, Allison's contacts, Allison's education and ideas. All that Podco would have been doing would have been distributing it, and then they didn't because Allison did not sign that contract.
I was collaborating with a production company who was truly wonderful at first, but then they switched their legal team, and the new person decided on the recording of the final episode that in order to move forward, I needed to sign a contract stating I would not get paid a cent for my work up front, though their team would. Further, on the back end, their company would get to make around $100,000 from ad revenue before I would see a single cent.
When Allison featured again on the Vulnerable podcast, it was like mentioned between the two of them that it was almost to be distributed with Podco, and then it didn't work out. The fact that Allison was on the podcast probably points to them being on at least decent terms, or I think more likely that Allison is more professional about these kinds of things, right? Allison was going to address it in the podcast in a much more professional way than we would expect if this same situation had happened with Alexa, I think. The Dear Hollywood podcast is great. It's legitimately very good. You should listen to it. It took me a long time to get around to it because I knew that it was like brain food in a way that Eat Predators is not. So I wanted to wait until I had more time to devote mental space to it before I started. But I had already known from my friend Kit, who had told me how excellent it is, that it was something I would enjoy. This podcast makes Eat Predators Daily feel like really junky fast food, and then you're finally eating something with like nice and also well-seasoned vegetables. This podcast is well edited, it's well produced. Although Allison had to reshoot it after they broke that contract that seems to have been with Podco. Every single outfit that they wear is immaculate. Like, this isn't the point, but they are so gender. I honestly am glad for them that the Dear Hollywood podcast isn't locked into Podco. Although I think maybe it would have benefited from the distribution. I also think that it would have shaped into a much different podcast, though. If we look at the way that the views shake out on things like the Ned's Declassified podcast, when they really lean into their clickbait and scandal versus similar topics with Dear Hollywood, the views start off pretty high, but as my friend pointed out, they tend to drop once things are more nuanced or more focused on how to make change in the industry, which is very much what the focus of Dear Hollywood is. Allison Stoner, I think, is very aware of how defensive people can get if they come at this specifically coming from a perspective of this is terrible and you were terrible for doing this to me, so you should feel bad and will you apologize? Versus their perspective, which seems to be that they're aware that the way that they grew up was suboptimal, but their main concern, rather than chasing down apologies for themselves or mobilizing people to act on their behalf, is a change in the actual industry. because Allison identifies not as the victim of a predator, but as somebody who was part of an exploited working class, a class of children who are not given proper protections. Another good thing about Dear Hollywood not being a Podco podcast is that it seems to have stopped Alexa from beefing with it yet, though we'll see. That actually brings me to notable beef number 4. Jeanette McCurdy. This one's like kind of a one-sided beef, like I said earlier. I'm not entirely sure how much Jeanette McCurdy even knows Alexa exists. Alexa used Jeanette McCurdy's book, I'm Glad My Mom Died, as like a book for the Eat Predators book club. You just saw me realize in real time I have to add another tangent about the Eat Predators book club. And I think has like responded to comments in the past saying like, oh, you should get Jeanette McCurdy on the pod, and said that she would want to, but Jeanette McCurdy has not been on the podcast, and I don't think that that's likely. Part of that, I think, might be because of the way that Alexa speaks about her. Now, this isn't as bad as Christy Carlson Romano, who apparently has referred to her outright as Sam from iCarly, which, if you read Jeanette McCurdy's book at all, I don't think you maintain the ability to do that without cringing at yourself. But I do think that there's a pretty obvious undertone in the way that Alexa talks about Jeanette having been part of what mobilized her into protesting at Nickelodeon.
No one reached out to me in 2019 when I came forward about Dan Schneider. I came forward just on live. Wait, let me see, Marissa. Your work matters, your voice matters, your feelings and opinions matter. The community you built feels how much this matters. Thank you so much, Marissa. I'm always so happy to see you here. Thank you so much, Marissa. What was I saying?
This is not the most generous read that I could give this, but it is what keeps sticking with me, especially as I've come back to it with concerns about Alexa as an activist. Check out the way that she frames this.
So yeah, in 2019, you know, I never got a book deal or anything. I never had like a YouTube channel or anything. I never really had anything. And so I just wanted to get the information out. And so I went on Instagram Live and told a lot of my story about Zoe 101 and Dan Schneider, etc. And nobody came to me about it. No one. But no one came forward to me. Like no one came to me, wanted to talk to me, wanted to make an article about it. Honestly, wanted anything, you know, didn't want to do anything with what I was coming forward about. And, you know, fast forward when Jeanette McCurdy's book came out, you know, and well-deserved. That was a long time coming. And the thing with that, though, was once I read Jeanette McCurdy's thing, you know, instead of thinking about my own book deal or like my own YouTube channel, I was like, I'm gonna go protest fucking Nickelodeon.
I think there's a lot of things about that that are just deeply unexamined. Number one, nobody just gave Jeanette McCurdy a book deal. If having been a bit character on a sitcom for children was enough to give you a best-selling memoir, everyone who has been on a sitcom would have done that by now. I'm pretty sure, and have been since I read it, that if I'm Glad My Mom Died was released as a book by somebody who had not had a successful career as a child, but had had similar experiences with their mother and was writing about the same things that Jeanette wrote about, it still would have been very critically successful, because it's a good book. It's a memoir, and like I said earlier, it's not even mostly about Nickelodeon. It comes up, but the real point of I'm Glad My Mom Died is about the work that Jeanette did in therapy, the work that she had to do to learn boundaries and how to heal from having existed as somebody who was meant to make her mother happy at all times. That's what's being examined in the book, and I think not something that has been examined closely enough by Alexa when she read the book in the book club to really understand that, if she's still out here saying things like that apologies are as good as therapy. That really doesn't sound like something that is advocated for at all by the worldview that is promoted in the book, and not that liking a book means that you have to fully co-sign its worldview, but one of them is a lot more healed and nuanced than the other one, and the one that's not more healed and nuanced is kind of trying to yank itself up on its credibility based on the nuanced one. I'm better than the person who is more healed and thoughtful about the way that they're approaching this, because I didn't think about getting a book deal. I just went to go protest. You have to write a book to get a book deal. And for that book to be cared about by pretty much anyone, it has to be like any good at all. A book that was beginning and ending at the fact that Jeanette's life was worsened by the fact that she worked for Nickelodeon would not have been a good book. And it's not the book that she wrote. She also really doesn't seem to intentionally be the face of this movement. I would classify, again, somebody like Alison Stoner, who is actually doing that work, closer to what needs to be looked at. But it does very much feel to me, and not just to me, I have a few friends I've been bouncing all of this off of, that she kind of wants to align herself with Jeanette because she wants to be thought of right on that same level and right at that same scale. But, and this is me, not my friends, I just think she's not at that same scale, either artistically or in terms of her understanding of nuance and boundaries and the important work of therapy. Notable beef number 5 was weird and pretty quickly aborted once she noticed that it wasn't getting the kind of public support that she clearly expected. I even initially forgot to put this one on my list, even though I saw it as it happened, and it was one in the entire trunk of red flags I had noticed and made myself ignore about Alexa. Notable beef number 5 is Alexa versus Kesha. Like, Kesha, like key $, ha, Kesha. Now, it didn't get very far. The specifics of this are that Kesha was going to be performing at a festival that also featured Alexa's ex-husband. Alexa did not assume any, innocence or lack of knowledge on Kesha's part in the initial tweets that she was making about these, just based on the tone from what I can recall from how she was addressing this. The expectation very much seemed to be that Kesha should have already known better and never have been associated with it, and I don't even think that public pressure for people not to perform with known abusers is a bad thing, but considering who Kesha is, the optics of attacking her are weird and bad, and even her fans noticed that. By the time she did the stream that was going to be an open letter to Kesha, Kesha had pulled out of that concert, so instead the stream is just about the fact that that almost happened. But if Kesha had still been going to perform in that concert at the time of the live stream, it would have been an open letter to her about how harmful that is. Again, if this had all been being presented as a neutral, maybe you don't know this thing, I would have maybe had different opinions about it, but publicly going after Kesha is such a look, and not a good one. Like, Kesha also is a woman who was abused by somebody in the music industry very publicly, and then also abused through a series of drawn-out, complicated legal battles. She's somebody who doesn't really see the same level of support for the predatory contract that she was trapped in as Taylor Swift has gotten for re-recording her masters, because there's been a lot of publicity around her campaign, and because there's money in making Dr. Luke look good and Kesha look crazy. That would be something that I would have really expected Alexa to understand, and to not want to contribute to negative public image of Kesha. But she has the excuse that she wasn't thinking about it as being contributing to negative public opinion of Kesha. for everything that she preaches about wanting survivors to be united and to stand together, to approach that from such a place that seemed like such a bad faith reading just is weird. And because it like resolved itself so quickly, I had forgotten about it until I started really digging into my mind palace about all of these things that I've rolled my eyes at over the last year or so. We are gonna run through some beef kind of fast because a lot of this follows the same form as notable beef number 6, but it is going to be nuanced, hence the sign. I have assigned Alexa versus Pod Meets World as notable beef number 6. It's a more serious topic than beef would convey, considering what I already said about beef, but I'm specifically calling it beef because it is not something that involves Alexa, that Alexa has inserted herself into, and we're looking at it more from that lens than from what I'm actually saying. But I am going to provide you with a different read on her take on some of the other child actors in Hollywood writing letters of support for Drake Bell's abuser, Brian Peck. On an episode of Pod Meets World, which is just the same thing as the Ned's Declassified podcast, except for the guys from the Boys Meet World, but I haven't seen any of it other than this one episode. They talked about the Brian Peck case at around the same time that it was coming out in media coverage ahead of Quiet on Set. In this episode, they expressed their regret for having written letters in support of Brian. They show remorse and feel really, really badly and disavow the things that they had previously said in support of Brian Peck. You would think that this would have been satisfactory to Alexa, considering that as of recently, an apology has been the sole focus of her activism, but it wasn't, because they didn't previously privately apologize to Drake. Just as she didn't have any nuance for Corey Feldman being the same person as Drake Bell, she also doesn't have any nuance for the fact that these kids who were asked to write letters to support this adult man they were friends with were also being groomed. Like, I want to be clear, it's not the same level of harm that's done by sexually violating somebody, but this was a guy who was able to tell these kids, like, hey man, you know, it's just me, it's just your buddy. It's not really my fault that I was having sex with a teenager. I didn't know he wasn't that old. Any circumstance where you're putting a child into a situation where they feel like the proper thing to do in that situation is write you a letter and support you, I think the closest word we have to describe what that is grooming. I'm not at all against holding accountable adults who have written letters in support of rapists. I think Ashton Kutcher and Mila Kunis deserved the backlash that they got for those Danny Masterson letters, but also those Danny Masterson letters weren't from years ago while they were children who were also being, in some form, if not sexually, targeted by an adult who had inappropriate relationships with other children. She has no nuance for this, and despite the fact that she went on Megyn Kelly tonight, she also is trying to like align the Pod Meets World people with Pizzagate for reasons I don't fully understand. She's also said before, and this isn't a full tangent because I don't want to go look for it, but she'll have like an audio or a camera issue and kind of play up for her audience like, oh, stuff cuts out once I start talking about stuff. Like once I start talking about Nickelodeon or Epstein, I always have microphone and camera issues. And again, a little in-joke with your friends if you're like video calling and you're like, I'm being censored. Like I literally made the joke to my friend when they tried to share my lesbian video on Facebook and it got erased. I was like, we're being silenced. But like actively playing into that when you know that you have people who are requesting you to cover Epstein and Pizzagate stuff is a choice, and so is going on Megyn Kelly. Like, the choice to just appear on Megyn Kelly's show really says a lot, I think, about who she's trying to market this feminism to. Because the thing is that once feminism is worthless enough, it is palatable to the left and to the right. She wouldn't be grifting on Megyn Kelly if this wasn't something that at least some right-wing people were into. Because playing into the language of we need to protect the children and there's this big conspiracy that's happening is a really delicate tightrope. And it's not one that she's navigating with much grace. Notable beef number 7 is with Josh Peck for a similar public but not private apology ordeal. After Quiet on Set and the revelations about Drake Bell having been a victim of Brian Peck, Josh's statement was along the lines of like, I never knew, but he still held to the stance that he had previously taken during his like press for his book, that he and Drake weren't really friends. And Alexa responds to this, I think, strangely.
And what I really want to see is just that the Nickelodeon stars actually just all support each other, you know, and don't talk about them. Like I heard a Josh quote, you know, a while back of him basically comparing his friendship or his, you know, his relationship with Drake Bell as just another, like as if it was somebody you worked with at like Coffee Bean, basically at a coffee shop. I just thought that was so sad. And I keep seeing Nick stars and just people, this is about people in general, treating each other like this when there's really honestly no reason to.
Like, I truly don't think, actually, that having been on a television set is inherently more bonding than having worked together at a coffee shop. And I think that it really ties into the fact that she had immediately assumed that because she was being brought up by other people earlier, it would immediately be, oh, her life is so hard, I feel so bad for her. You know, like, just weird expectations of what the importance of both being famous does to you as the main character in someone else's life. Tangent number 3, though, and I'm not moving away from my nuance corner for this, but I'll turn the light off. I don't like Josh Peck. I don't. He had Jeanette McCurdy on his podcast, Good Guys, and apparently at some point after they recorded the episode, she asked him to delete it and not air it. And he did, but he has like held that over her head multiple times in other episodes. She hasn't been back on the podcast, but he mentions like, oh, we had Jeanette, but she asked us to delete the episode. Josh told Tana Mojo in an episode of her podcast that he had been blocked by Jeanette McCurdy because he continued to say, like, you owe us another episode. When are you going to come back and record? Queen shit. I love her. I think Josh Peck sucks. I think it's totally possible for your experience as a man to have been that Dan was just a difficult boss. But to have worked on the Amanda show and have presumably seen the way that Dan treated his female cast members, and then could have had that in the back of your mind for comparing it to how you were being treated as one of the boys, and didn't because you're a little bit too short-sighted. I read Happy People Are Annoying and I kind of enjoyed it. I did the audiobook, which I think made it easier to get through, but not surprised that he feels so entitled to having Jeanette come be on his podcast, because I think with how sad he was that Vine shut down and how hard he was trying to make YouTube work, like, he really wants the podcast thing to be the thing. And he knows that an episode with him and Jeanette would really take off. And I think if he's behaving this way and he's that, like, entitled to having her tell her story, as much as I'm very curious what was discussed and what made her not want to air that podcast, I think it's great that we don't have an episode of that. I think it's great that she didn't re-record if she didn't feel comfortable with it. I love Jeanette. Support for Jeanette. Josh Peck had Dan Schneider at his wedding, so it's not like he's, like, forgiven or, like, cool or whatever, or even, like, necessarily. And, like, not having him at his wedding wasn't even, I don't know if it was a principled stand against what Drake had been convicted of or accused of, or if it was just that they weren't that close. But it's so fine that they weren't that close, And I think it's weird that Alexa doesn't think that's fine. Notable beef number 8 is Taryn from SNL for a similar thing, for having written a letter in support of Brian Peck and for not privately and then also publicly apologizing to Drake Bell. She's made multiple videos about this. I referred to in my Drake Bell video that Alexa was giving a statement that she had gotten directly from Drake. That's what she's referring to when she gives this statement from Drake, who has still not appeared on her podcast.
I also gave him as a gift. Sorry. Just sad. Okay. I also gave him as a gift a cardboard cutout of Princess Leia because he was obsessed with Star Wars, and I worked with Carrie Fisher, so I got it signed for him. And People Magazine, when he first got on SNL, I think People Magazine did a spread on the new cast and said, bring your favorite thing from home. And he got a picture with it in the magazine and told the story of how I got it for him, and he still wrote the letter. We were friends, I thought. I mean, is that not heartbreaking, though? I think that's pretty heartbreaking.
And hopefully you see what I was getting at earlier with the, like, weird fake overwhelm. It just makes things feel like line readings and not like actual communication. Notable beef number 9, now that she's like 10 toes down into making Drake Bell defense content and begging other people to beg for his forgiveness, the Ned's Declassified podcast, as I mentioned earlier, sticks their foot in their mouth again. They're doing a live stream and joking around, and they make inappropriate remarks that I don't think even honestly make very much sense, but also just are the middle school edgy humor that I already said that I don't like from these people, right? They're like, give us your holes, Dan. And then the guy who played Ned is like, oh, we shouldn't joke about that. Yeah, the Drake Bell shit is horrible. And Alexa is very upset about it being referred to as the Drake Bell shit, and she's also upset because when the guy who played Ned says, oh, it's crazy nobody knew, nobody ever talked about it, Lindsay said, with the same kind of delivery that she gave that ex-bestie, she's out there spouting off into the universe, just like casual, like devastating read you only get from somebody who used to really know you, and she says, I'll tell you who was talking about it. Alexa has responded to that. Like I said, she just wants them to apologize privately to Drake. I think the public apology that was made was fine. I think they shouldn't have done it in the first place. But again, I just don't like these people or their podcast or their sense of humor. Although part of their excuse for why they were like not really paying attention to what they were saying included that the guy who played Cookie was editing the sound. So even though a bunch of people are getting cut into podcasts, I guess they have to edit their own podcasts. So that seems not worth it. Notable beef number 10, like the Kesha beef, is another almost beef. By which I mean, she almost made the recent P. Diddy houses getting searched thing about Nickelodeon and herself by extension. I'm actually glad that I took screenshots to send to my friend last night and be like, I can't believe she's making this about her, because a few hours before she streamed, she did change the thumbnail and title and presumably also the subject of the video to be about something else instead. I think maybe because she noticed that enough people probably would have thought that that was in poor taste, because maybe some things are not specifically about the rich white child star victims. But she had an intention to react to a P. Diddy episode of All That or something. I don't know. And I don't know if she actually did that anyway inside of the stream, but now it says, who enabled Brian Peck? Guys like us.
I probably could have found several more notable beefs, if you will, but I truly feel like by now you get the picture, right? Alexa wields her platform and her branding of herself as an activist to mobilize people around something whether or not she's directly involved in it and whether or not she's being fully reasonable. The thing is, though, is that the fact that sometimes it is reasonable, or at least plausible deniability of reasonableness, so it makes the times that she's not unreasonable like a little bit easier to forgive, right? How many times have I said, oh, I thought that was weird, and then I just kept pushing? But up until maybe 2 weeks ago, I would have said, I really like and respect and admire Alexa, and I can't just outright say that I still have a lot of respect for her. That's another reason that I realized very shortly after making the Drake Bell video that I needed to make another video about this, because the more I kept seeing from Alexa, the more my feelings went from respect and like critical support to a failure to even continue to co-sign a lot of the things that she's doing. And I think there are probably a lot of other people in similar boats where the previously held respect that they had for Alexa and the stated mission goal of eat predators overwhelmed their own judgment, their own feelings about it. And it's really hard to criticize women. Like, that sounds silly to say, probably, but also you might know exactly what I mean. I spent a lot of time making sure that I was being, as fair as I could be in some of these parts, in making sure that I wasn't going to paint her in a way that came across as hysterical, or like I was saying that, her allegations that she's made in the past are false, which is not a claim that I'm making here. It's hard to criticize women without feeling like you're giving a bunch of misogynists somewhere to jump on and be like, yeah, and also these other 10 million other things. So I think that, and the positioning of herself as, she did experience legitimate harm at the hands of Nickelodeon, and a lot of people feel guilt about that. I think that also contributes to kind of a parasocial relationship. Somebody who you feel guilty for having enjoyed watching as a child is giving you an opportunity to kind of pay penance for the fact that they had a bad experience with that. Again, it's not what I'm glad my mom died was about, but I'm happy to do that when a child star who I feel like went through a lot comes forward with something. I'm happy to support that and, read their book, buy it. But Alexa's not selling a book. She's selling like this very particular brand of activism. And when I was first filming this video, I kept saying, like the live streamification of activism, but I think it's actually something slightly different than that. We are so close to wrapping up here, but like I said, I did realize that I had my book club tangent completely abandoned somewhere. So, one more thing. The book club for Eat Predators is another good example of framing versus reality. As part of Alexa's branding of it's so terrible that these people wanted money, she says that she had originally wanted to add everybody who she was putting in her Eat Predators book club into an existing Discord. So that Discord server, which is it's like a big group chat with different individual channels for different things. I don't know what's on the Eat Predators Discord, or rather what was on it, because it has now 2 separate times shut down and seems to no longer exist. But Kaylee and Kay, who had been, responding to survivor emails and trying to get resources for people, were not on board with adding a bunch of people to the Discord. It had previously been agreed on that it would be a Patreon reward tier. So this thing that was meant to only have people who had supported the first year of the Eat Predators Patreon suddenly had something like 80 new members, apparently, added from Alexa's book club. And Alexa didn't really think about the extra work that this would be giving the other people to moderate. I really think a lot of Alexa's failings here were that she truly does not seem to think of herself as any kind of boss, although she does think of herself as a leader and creator and founder and person who should make all decisions and get all credit. So she wasn't thinking about the fact that it was actual labor that these other people were doing in terms of moderating the Discord. I think she assumed everybody was operating on the same level of passion project that she was for Eat Predators, and her level of passion means that she gets so passionate that she gets to get really worked up and walk away when things are upsetting to her, and that leaves other people behind to do the work of moderating and dealing with interpersonal conflicts. I mean, this is not the same thing, but I used to moderate Mountain Goats Facebook groups, and that was also kind of a collection of traumatized people, and even that was like actual work sometimes. If I was doing that on a full-time basis for people who had survived really terrible things and were explicitly there to be trying to talk about it in community with each other, I would also want to know I would eventually be able to get paid and access support for myself. This book club seemed to be like a kind of thrown together thing. Alexa does genuinely seem to have thought like, oh, it's just a little book club, oh well. But I just found that framing interesting because, again, it's a situation where she's telling a story expecting you to think that she was the one in the right, that everybody else should have just been cool with adding 80 new people to a Discord. But that's a pretty intense change to make to an agreement that only people who paid you an amount of money are going to be accessing this thing. The Eat Predators Instagram itself actually was originally another account, and the name was changed to be Eat Predators when they were all acting as a collective. So it's not as if the other people who had opinions about this Discord suddenly being blown up in scale were coming from like an unfounded place. Like, Eat Predators truly was not originally only Alexa's, even though it was originally Alexa's. Honestly, the fact that that existing account already had a few thousand subscribers is, again, evidence to the fact that there were other people in this space doing that work before Alexa. A ton of activists, and even, yeah, including that lawyer who suggested a bunch of them link up. Since I think I'm done mentioning the Good Morning Mayberry podcast from here on out, you can find Kaylee on the Rage Girls podcast. I have not yet listened to it because I've been working on this for the last few days and not doing much else, but I'm looking forward to checking it out, and I'll link to it in the description below. I also wanted to point to @exposingrich on Twitter. They've had a lot of really helpful information that they've shared about this on their profile, which seems to have been locked in Twitter jail for like a week in probably retribution from Alexa fans mass reporting. Exposing Rich did a really good job laying that information out. You can find the same things going on at the same profile name on TikTok too if you're over there. The thing is, real activism, like activism that is based on change and restorative justice, inherently just has to be less concerned with not upsetting its spokesperson celebrity. Actual activism, real activism that is concerned with survivors and with justice and with making sure that cycles of harm are not reperpetuated, needs to be less concerned than whatever Eat Predators is with making sure that its celebrity advocate feels appropriately validated. Because the thing is this apology activism of Alexa Nikolas seems to begin and end at being validated. It's about validating the victims. It's about validating the victim's right to continue without growth or self-actualization to identify as a victim perpetually, so long as they change that word to survivor instead. It's about validating the pain that is felt by people who turned around and did awful and inappropriate things, which leads to letting them off the hook once you identify with them. For as much as I think the whole Alexa, Corey, Christy thing means that Alexa's behaviors regarding Drake Bell make her a hypocrite, I also do think, in a way, she is kind of trying to practice what she preaches with this. Because what she preaches mostly is that victims should be validated and celebrated and apologized to. That if they're ever brought up in the presence of somebody else, that person will say, oh, I know I feel so bad for them. They've had such a hard life. The thing that's done with actual activism that is focused on more than just apology and validation, is that it gets held to account. It gets criticized and commented on by other activists and writers and thinkers. And while people do become notable within movements, that notability should never ever mean that they are above critique. Again, while I don't blame Drew Barrymore for still being brainwashed about the brainwashing institute that she was placed in, I do think that there's a real concern about what validating the decision some parents make to do that to their children does on the kind of scale that Drew Barrymore has. It normalizes that as an option, as something that somebody who feels like their kid is really out of control should just go ahead and do, when it's not something anybody should do to their child. Similarly, I don't blame Alexa for being unhealed or like unrealized in her potential as a thoughtful feminist or activist or leader. But I do blame her for what she is leading people to. But I do hold her accountable for how this apology activism promotes a flawed understanding of justice or of your own responsibility to yourself to process and heal from your trauma, regardless of an apology or lack thereof. There might already be a word for what I'm talking about when I say apology activism, but if there is, I don't know it. I just think it's the real root of what my issue is with what Alexa is doing. Like making money off of girl boss feminism, capitalism, again, not really my thing, but not something that I would talk about for hours. And I'm concerned about the people who are supporting Eat Predators, thinking that they are like buying into this safe community when it's by someone who doesn't understand the importance of moderation or of having people who actually know what they're doing around you. I'm also concerned to what it does to people like me, people who are pushing aside their hesitations at what Alexa is saying because they don't want to criticize a woman too harshly for their brand of feminism, and who are hearing this message and might be a little bit less combative to it than I am. It's very hard to let go of the idea of yourself as a survivor inherently making you special. It's magical thinking, though. It would be really nice if survivors were magic. Being a survivor of something is not inherently inspirational. It does not mean anything about you other than that something terrible happened to you, because that would mean that who you are and what you are is defined by somebody else's actions. And isn't that less inspiring than the fact that you get to choose to do whatever you want, no matter what might have happened to you? I'm saying this as somebody who is fully estranged from my parents, and if you watch my videos, I don't keep that a secret. Like, I do mention the fact that I wasn't treated well in my childhood somewhat often, but I also don't think that anything about myself or my strength inherently came from that in a way that I'm comfortable with giving them credit for. And clinging so much to the idea of being a survivor, of having been a victim, and of that victimhood making you special just feels really dangerous to me, especially when it's paired with things like a good apology competes with years of therapy. Nothing competes with years of therapy. I'll directly steal my best friend's joke here. Like, maybe not being traumatized in the first place could compete with years of therapy, but other than that, no. Even people who haven't been directly traumatized in ways that they can point to as like their root issue could benefit from therapy. We all live underneath this capitalist and patriarchal society, and muddying the waters from what we can possibly do to change that and how we can support each other as we're all struggling in it together, to chasing down one specific person's pet grudges is just not good. That real meaningful activism requires actual goals, and those goals also have to be outside of yourself at times. To be a real advocate and activist, you have to care about goals that are sometimes not only beneficial to yourself and the victims who are most like you, but to understand a broader scope of how things intersect with the things that you struggle with, and how sometimes other portions of the fight might be more important. An apology does nothing but make you feel better, and actual justice, actual restorative justice, not only doesn't always make you feel better, it probably often won't. But it's not about the direct victims so much as it is about putting structures in place to prevent future victims from being created. Allison Stoner was there at the State House in Ohio when the Kidfluencer Protection Bill was announced, and they've done quite a bit of coverage about it on their platform. It's very in line with things that they talk about wanting children in the industry to be protected. Again, when I said earlier that like Alexa seems to enjoy having therapy words, I sometimes will hear Alexa say like, oh, we want protections for children, but she never digs into that the way she digs into the specifics about the apologies that she wants. This Kidfluencer Protection Bill essentially introduces a Coogan account for the children of influencers, meaning that they would need to actually be paid for appearing in social media content that's being monetized during their childhood. These are real, actual protections, things that change the future and the world we live in, even if just incrementally. Part of wanting to behave and be perceived as a collective and an activist, or just as somebody who is generally organizing with others, means having to be able to care about struggles that you yourself did not participate in. Allison Stoner is not only showing up for former child stars and former child voice actors, they're showing up for children who are being exploited because they see it as an industrial problem, and as an industrial problem that doesn't only happen in Hollywood. The credit Alexa gets just feels misplaced, and people seem to understand that placing that credit onto Christy is a misplacement, but I just wanted to get all of my thoughts out there onto why Alexa also feels like a misplacement of credit to me. Like I said earlier, just for the sake of other people who were in that same boat with me. I am a little bit nervous that this might put me on her radar, and I would really, really like to not be the main character of the week on Eat Predators, but this still seemed worth it because, again, inherently, by being a feminist, you're asking other feminists to critique you, and especially when you have been so open about your critique of other feminists in the past. If you enjoyed the video, maybe share it with somebody who is not Alexa. Maybe, someone like us who also has some thoughts about Eat Predators that they haven't been sure how to verbalize. Or maybe just share it even just privately on Facebook. That actually helps a lot in terms of getting the video out there. And as you can tell, I am still very new at making videos. If you enjoyed this video and you would like more, nuanced analysis from me in the future, I would really appreciate it if you would subscribe. I also do have a handful of other videos already uploaded that you can look through, and you can find some links in the description if you're looking for more of me. Thanks for watching. Thanks for taking the time to hear me out on this one, especially when this video is so long. Let's see if I can get my cat to answer that question she dodged earlier. But that's it. That's the video. Let's see if we can get my cat to answer that question she dodged earlier.
What do you think? What do you think about Eat Predators? Do you think that they're a reputable organization? Really? Well, I guess that says it all.